Marks World Press Freedom Day, and it comes in the midst of conflict, repressive governance and other factors. Globally, journalists work under difficult and unpredictable conditions to get the story out. Scores of journalists and other media workers have been killed while in the field. In acknowledging these events, the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, said, "When we lose a journalist, we lose our eyes and ears to the outside world. We lose a voice for the voiceless." Let's talk about these experiences with journalists who work on the front line. Akram Al Sataari, Democracy Now! Correspondent and AP Palestine correspondent. Adil, Bradlow, journalist and hostile environment specialist based in Berlin. And Dr. Zubeida, Jaffer, journalist, author and activist. To all of you, thank you very much for making time today. Appreciate you. The Committee for the Protection of Journalists, Zubeida, says 72 out of 99 journalists killed worldwide in 2023 were Palestinian journalists reporting on the war in Gaza. 4 were Israeli, 3 were Lebanese. The deadliest year for media in a decade. What's your assessment, looking at what's happening not only right now, but what some of the increasing trends are that form risks to journalists working, especially in conflict zones?
Iman, this is the biggest election year in world history, 2024. And we are seeing something that we've never seen before, that the rules that apply to engagement, the rules that apply to work that cover journalists, doctors, etc., it's all flying out of the window. And so this is extremely dangerous because we just don't know. There's a free for all, and we are in a conflict situation where there's no protection for the work that we do. And this is a very, very tense moment.
Let's talk about the lack of protections. And Akram, you would know this probably in a much darker way than a lot of other journalists working in conflict zones, given the high density of attacks and the deaths and the killings of journalists in territories like Gaza. Share with us your experience.
Well, you have said it right. The situation in Gaza features a lack of protection. That lack of protection coming from the fact that Israeli occupation is not observing the dictates of the international law, is not observing the dictates of the Geneva Convention, and the two additional protocols that highlight the importance of protecting medical teams and also joint media teams and press teams that are doing any kind of urge. The media at large is protected according to the dictates of the international law and also according to the domestic constitutions in Europe, also Palestine, and the region. The Israeli occupation has been dealing with the Palestinians at large, including the medical teams, the journalists, the civilian objects, the civilian facilities, in a way that features indiscriminatory bombardment, shooting, destruction, displacement, and all the things that you have been hearing about and seeing in the Gaza. And all you are seeing is just a glimpse into the grim situation people have been living in the Gaza. When it comes to journalists, they have paid a very heavy price in the sense that some of them lost their lives, some of them lost their limbs, some of them lost their careers, some of them lost their future prospects when they were targeted and they were killed. Some of them were killed by themselves and some others were killed along with their families. The situation is more than just catastrophic, and nothing tangible has been done globally for the sake of just holding Israel accountable, or at least mitigating the risk that the journalists are exposed to. Every single work task that the journalist is undertaking for the sake of just showing the suffering of the people or just reflecting the reality on the ground might be the last trip for that particular journalist. When they go to the areas that were targeted, some of them were killed in the areas that they're covering. Some of them were killed en route to those areas. Some of them were killed when they're back and returning from those areas. So an extremely difficult and catastrophic situation that is still continuous, and that is still undermining the ability of the Palestinian journalists to do their work in the manner. And one piece of information, the number of journalists killed in Gaza in the last 6 or 7 months is 4 times bigger than the all the journalists worldwide that were killed in the last 4 or 5 years.
That's a stark statistic when you frame it like that, Akram, and also just hearing you say that what the world is seeing, which is already a harrowing and a tragic picture, is just a glimpse of the reality on the ground. And Adil, I want to bring it to you. There's a lot that journalists do in the field and see that the general public doesn't. And for many reasons, there have to be some levels of hygiene in what we can and cannot beam to the rest of the world. Talk to us about the realities of working in the field, seeing the kinds of things, the levels of destruction that you have to see. I know that one of the areas you've worked in recently is in conflict-ridden Ukraine.
Yeah, I was in Ukraine at the beginning of the war, and for a few months. But I was most recently in Palestine, and I just want to reiterate what Akram was saying: is that never before have journalists been targeted in the way that Israel has targeted them. It's gone out of its way to try and kill the message and the messenger. This is clear policy of the Israeli state. And it's something that we've never really had to deal with before. There was a kind of immunity for journalists before. But now, with propaganda being at the forefront of news coverage, of trying to control the message, the way that the Israelis have gone about it is to basically just target the journalists. I mean, it happened over and over again. It's not a coincidence. It's a deliberate strategy. And very little has been said about it, done about it. It's incredible how quiet journalist organizations have been on this issue. I mean, you're right, we do have to sanitize the news, but what is unique about the Gaza situation is that for the first time, citizen journalism has come to the fore. And so in many respects, the platforms like Instagram, YouTube are getting an unfiltered view of what is going on. And this is something that has undermined the Israeli narrative, that undermined attempts to control the message. And it's something to be lauded, but also something to be wary of, because quite often you have misinformation. So we're dealing with a changing news environment. And on this day, I think journalism itself is under threat, not just because we're being targeted and killed, but because basically attempts to control the narrative are destroying the credibility of news organizations. I mean, you just have to look at how CNN and BBC have not risen to the challenge of critical news coverage in Israel. I mean, if you wanted to know what's going on in Israel, Palestine, the channel of record is Al Jazeera. And it just, and now the Israelis are looking to shut it down. I mean, there's legislation in play at the moment to close down the Al Jazeera offices in Israel.
Zubeida, I'd love your thoughts on what Adil's just talked about, and also what he describes as, kind of like a silence by organizations that should be representing, lobbying for, governments not only to stand by international law provisions around reporting and the rights of journalists to be able to do their work, but also organizations that lobby for journalists and journalist organizations. Is it also your view that they have been far too quiet?
There has been some response, Iman, for the Committee for the Protection of Journalists and a few others, but generally we've not put our foot down, and journalist organizations have not put their foot down. Journalist organizations are split down the middle in our country too, and they're not taking a firm stand and saying that not in our name. It's an appalling situation, and I think that we are at a turning point where the world is going. There's two sides. One side that says we need to protect the international rules of engagement in conflicts, and then there's the other side is just letting it go. So it's Iman. It's, from what I see, I think the voices of journalists are far too mute, and that we need a much bigger effort to object to what's happening today.
Akram, how does this change from your perspective? Working under fire, you have, every day, one of the overriding imperatives surely must be to just stay alive and be able to do your work. What should the rest of the world, especially the journalism community, be doing, or the media community be doing?
Well, they should intensify their communication to try to influence the different UN bodies for the sake of just making a decision or just passing a resolution that would underline the importance of protecting journalism. However, unfortunately, with the structure of the international community today and with all justice mechanisms, I don't think there's much that can be done or translated into action. Now, the major problem for the Israeli population is the ICJ and ICC, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, and they seem to have already alerted Israel to start doing things for the sake of just whitewashing itself. I think there should be also another pressure practiced and advocacy work by the different media bodies, international and local and regional ones, for the sake of just pushing towards filing cases before the ICJ and ICC. And I think that would create another leverage, would serve eventually in the best interest of the Palestinian journalists who are living in Gaza. Living in Gaza by itself is a challenge, let alone for someone who needs to cover the truth about the situation, who needs to move, who needs fuel, who needs transportation, who needs safety, who needs personal protection equipment, and who end up, even when they're wearing the PPE, the personal protection equipment, they are being targeted, they are being killed. Some of them were just using the small drone for the sake of just documenting the situation in some particular area in Rafah, and they ended up being targeted and burned alive when they were targeted, and people couldn't do anything for them. I think all those cases should be collected, should be documented, should be sorted out, and should be soon applied to the respective courts and tribunals for the sake of just making Israel understand that it's not just about rhetoric, it's not just about statements, it's not about just condemnation, it's about something tangible that is being done for the sake of protecting the people. Otherwise, you would hear every day a news about someone who's dying because of the fact that they were targeted, because of the fact they were arrested, they were abused. They're not allowed to do their job. So we need actions, because actions speak louder, and they are the ones that would alert the oppressor and teach them that they should be respecting or at least observing some of the dictates of the international law. Otherwise, the suffering is likely to continue. And with the impunity that is prevailing, no one is holding the Israeli population accountable, and that's why they wouldn't feel stressed out for the sake of changing anything they are doing, even the craziest and most extreme things that are being done to the journalists, to the doctors as well, to the humanitarian aid workers, and to every single person who is in relationship to that ongoing conflict in Gaza and Palestine.
Adil, we've seen condemnation, across the board, and sometimes from the highest level. Even the United Nations Human Rights Commission alarmed at the extraordinarily high numbers of journalists and media workers killed, attacked, injured and detained in the occupied territories, particularly in Gaza in recent times. From your perspective, what changes and what can materially impact or change the way that journalists, particularly in conflict zones, work and give them high levels of protection?
Well, I think it starts at home. Basically, Akram is right. Allowing Israel free reign has been a disaster. And the main media organizations have ignored this issue primarily. It's organizations like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, they've thrown their lot in behind Israel. I mean, they operate. They allow the Israelis to operate with an air of impunity, and if there's no punishment, if there's no repercussions, they will just carry on doing it. So until the main media organizations hold the Israelis to account in a meaningful way, get the information out there about what is actually going on, and stop falling for the spin that is put on these situations, then I don't see much changing on the ground. I mean, we will continue to be targeted. It's a much more dangerous situation now. I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like to be a journalist in Gaza, going to bed at night wondering if they're going to drop a bomb on your head while you're sleeping. looking for food for your family and for yourself to survive during the day, getting fuel so you can get to the story, having fuel for your generator to run these things. This is the daily struggle of journalists in Gaza, and on the front line of wars. It's got out of hand.
Zubeida, perhaps just squeeze in another response from you before we end. We have about half a minute or so to talk. We have focused a lot on what's happening in the occupied territories in Gaza because, as has been pointed out repeatedly, an exponentially high number of journalists over a short period of time killed in that territory. What are some of the other places that are bleeding for journalists in the world today?
I'm not, that familiar with all the other places, but of course we have the war in Ukraine, which is unacceptable and which should be brought to a stop. And then you have conflict zones, on our continent as well. But the World Press Freedom Index was released this morning, and South Africa, there's every year since I've watched it, South Africa has no journalists killed, no journalists jailed year on year. And this year we stand 38 out of 180 countries, while the US stands at 55. So we are way above the US in terms of the Press Freedom Index. So I think if we bring it down to our situation, that we, despite all our difficulties, we've been able to hold the center as far as the protection of journalists is concerned. So that is a moment that makes me feel proud if I measure it against what's happening all over the world. Yeah. And it is something that we should value.
Yeah.
Iman, if I may just quickly, the situation in Sudan is the critical one. There are no journalists operating in Sudan except for Al Jazeera. It is an impossible situation there. And our government remains quiet on that issue. Why are the Sudanese allowed to deliberately target and kill journalists too? This is also where the situation is out of hand.
Yeah, Cameroon as well, Adil, and there's some calls there by local NGOs as well for the protection of journalists working in those territories too. Thank you to all of you. All I can say is be safe, and thank you for the work that you do in being the eyes and ears of those communities who don't have direct access to tell the world their stories. Adil, Bradlow, Akram Al Sataari and Dr. Zubeida Jaffer, appreciate you. More news and views when we return. Do stay with us.